Obviously, the supply and demand matter for us as a company, but they don't matter for the world. The world needs this, whether there's supply or demand. We need to just fix it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a mechanism, right? At the end of the day, we need the carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
We just need to suck it out.
As the big biodiversity, I don't know if it was a treaty or accord that was signed, carbon is only one of our big problems that this kind of solution can solve. Like switching to using a carbon credit that involves switching to green energy doesn't address the biodiversity crisis, whereas nature-based carbon credits do.
Yeah. Welcome back to your AI injection. This week, we're speaking with Kelsey Josund. Kelsey's a machine learning engineer at Pachama, an intriguing green startup. I can't wait to talk with her and understand how they're using AI to protect ecosystems, restore forests, and improve carbon markets. So, hey, Kelsey, thanks so much for being here. Please set the context for our discussion. So what's the problem you all at Pachama are solving?
We at Pachama work on verifying forest carbon credits, which means we work in the space of nature-based solutions for carbon capture, which basically means we let trees do it. And we just make sure that it's happening for real. The problem we're solving is verifying that these forests are as healthy and robust and real as everybody wants them to be.
As just like a regular person, what does it mean to offset your carbon? What are the credits? And how does that link up to what you guys are monitoring?
Yeah. So at a basic level, everything we do all the time is emitting carbon, and we need to be not doing that so much. As we make this transition to greener energy and cleaner tech, forests and all kinds of ecosystems do a great job of taking carbon out of the air through photosynthesis as these plants grow. The idea behind a carbon credit is if you can quantify how much a forest is growing, you can figure out how much carbon is being sucked out of the air by that forest. Where this gets tricky is in order to be a real offset, it needs to be a forest that wouldn't have grown without that.
How do you know that this wasn't just going to be there anyway?
So there's several parts to our verification process. We need to make sure that the forest people claim is there is actually there. We need to make sure that it's additional. That means that the forest is either healthier or bigger, or trees are growing back in a healthier or faster way, or the deforestation they're claiming to prevent is actually being prevented. If what they're claiming is preventing deforestation, it's not just going somewhere else. We need to also make sure that it's permanent, meaning that we can understand the risk of it being cut down or burning down or being hit by insects and take that into account when we're crediting it, so that if that were to happen, the credits could be redirected to a different forest. And that risk is part of what we model. And then verifiable, meaning we can tell what kinds of trees are there and what kind of ecosystem it is, and therefore can model how much carbon is in the trees, because the kind of forest you have in California versus Brazil have very different characteristics of how much carbon is stored in them. Finally, things about impact beyond carbon, which is not modeled with AI. That part is our experts on the ground, making sure basically that when you have a forest project, it's doing good things for the forest, but you don't want it to be coming at the expense of an indigenous community or something. So we want to make sure that the projects are good as a whole rather than just looking at the carbon.
Here's my ideal vision. I want to be able to offset my carbon. For every dollar I put in, I would know exactly what little plot of land and trees or what chunk of a tree I actually own. In a perfect world, I would have a real-time camera stream or something pointed right at it, and I would be able to track that back to a piece of land.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like one direction. And then in the other direction, I actually might go out and buy a plot of land and put it into your system somehow, and then go back and feed someone else like me and say, hey, look, I got this plot of land that I was going to have a Walmart go up or something, and I managed to buy it instead. How do I plug in? So maybe just fill us in on those two sides.
Yeah. So both of these are things that our solutions can help enable, but the current status quo doesn't support it all. So I guess I can talk a little bit about how this works without us. When you have a new plot of land that you want to turn into a carbon project, people have to go there, measure all the trees. And to some extent, that kind of thing still needs to happen because we have to be sure the kinds of trees are what they say they are. But then they have to do that again every 5 years to make sure the trees are still there. That's the monitoring step, which often is less frequent than every 5 years. It could be every 30 years. Or you can just be taking like the landholder's word for it. So our justification is that we use remote sensing to monitor that. So after the initial step of being like, the trees are this kind of tree, then we can continue to monitor using satellites. It's not quite a live stream, although we have talked about doing that for certain places where it'd be cool and more accessible to do. There's satellites up in the air all the time that we don't own or control, monitoring all these places. It's not as detailed as a live stream, but it's still like a frequent update, probably about monthly, have high quality data. Can't do it too much more frequently than that for a lot of them because of things like cloud cover.
So one of my challenges I have when I look at sites like this and I think, okay, I'm going to buy some offset, they'll point me typically to like some big, huge plot of land and maybe I see some pictures of it, but I don't actually know what I own. What is it I'm buying and how do I wrap my head around it as opposed to just being pointed to a picture of a forest?
So it is a little bit more abstract because you're buying a credit. And part of the reason we talk about it in those terms is because you can more easily compare forests of super different types. Also, the piece I mentioned about the risk to the forest, even if two forests have the same biomass per hectare, if one is at greater risk of deforestation or a higher risk of being burned down, you're going to need to protect more hectares of that land as a buffer against that risk. And so we can't just say, for X number of dollars, you protected Y amount of land, because it's going to vary greatly depending on what land it is.
And time, like what point in time it is. Yeah,
exactly. You're completely right that people want to see the degree of specificity. So that's a continual challenge. How do you translate this kind of abstract thing into something that is compelling to people? I'm working on this biomass side where I'm just looking at pictures and getting out numbers. I'm not even yet talking about the credits because I'm on just how much biomass is in this land. Then the risk modeling comes in to determine how much land you actually need for credit.
So on the risk side, you said something really interesting, like, okay, so for a given plot of land, you have to somehow assess its risk of basically not being a carbon sink. How do you quantify that risk?
There are industry standards of how much buffer you need to apply and the frequency of monitoring, which does allow things to slip through the cracks sometimes. We increase the frequency of monitoring so that if a forest from which credits have been issued gets destroyed, we can notify more quickly. And that will lead to reissuing, either redrawing project boundaries, protecting different land, ceasing to issue credits, or shifting where that money has gone. And this is an industry that's continuously changing, meaning if a forest burns down, maybe the land still needs to be protected because that land can still regrow.
Let's say you've got an acre of land inside one of the California forests that burned this summer. If you're tracking it, do you, for that acre of land, associate that specifically with a certain number of credits?
Yeah.
Once it burns down, do you delete those credits?
It will really depend on the specifics of what has happened. So when we're modeling biomass, we're looking at how much is actually in the trees at a given time. But what we're looking at to assess is trends and differences between the protected land versus unprotected land. Because as long as a tree is alive, the biomass is in that tree. But when the tree dies, that biomass is released into the atmosphere through decomposition or burning. If it's a protected forest, the total carbon of that stand of trees should remain constant. If an ecosystem can recover, the carbon credits are still valid in the sense that we're not protecting any specific tree, we're protecting an ecosystem. But if it gets to a point where the ecosystem itself is destroyed, then that's different, right? So a fire that comes through burning super hot and obliterates things is very different from a fire that comes through and thins the trees and they can come back healthily. That's some of the complexity in this monitoring piece. But the biggest aspect that we're looking at often is deforestation. Before
what you do, pre-AI, what exactly happened?
The very fundamental level of it is destructive sampling.
Okay.
Take a tree and burn it in a special sensor to come up with the carbon that's destroyed.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Obviously can't do that at scale because that is exactly the opposite of what we want.
Thing to do.
From there, they can derive what are called allometric equations, which are just matching equations to fit that measurement to measurements of trees. You can go based on tree density, actual wood density, and size to that kind of thing. And so those equations will be derived for tree species, for tree locations. There are tons of different ones. There's a lot in the literature about which one you should be using. And generally you want to use as specific as you can to what you have, like what kind of tree, both the species and the location. And they only take into account often like the above ground biomass, but sometimes they also include the roots. Sometimes you also need to take into account the other biomass in the forest beyond the trees. But basically, you go in, do an inventory, measure all the trees, plug that into the allometric equation, pick the correct equation, add the corrective factors for whether the equation is taking into account things other than above ground biomass in trees. And then you get a number, and that's the biomass for some area. It's very manual and time consuming, and there's a lot of room for error. One of the biggest challenges we face in applying machine learning to this is that our ground truth data is not that clean. And it's also very expensive to collect. So it's not a place like you can just go scrape the entire internet and train GPT-3 on this.
And it's probably not, I'm guessing it's not standardized either, like different governments hire independent consultants that do this sort of thing.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different data sets and a lot of trying to understand the characteristics of those data set. And from there, figuring out if we need to apply different corrective factors and how do we use it and how much do we trust it. Another big difficulty is that a lot of the sampling is done in healthy forests. And for governments will want to understand what their old growth forests are like. So they'll do all these measurements there. When we're trying to model a second growth forest or new planting, it's difficult because we don't have much data that reflects it, since the expensive, high quality data tends to be from national parks and things like that.
So are you mostly buying this data?
So a lot of our data is from government sources, so we don't have to buy it, but we do have to get access to it, which can take some work. Lots of universities have experimental forests. We do buy some data, but that actually tends to be our satellite data that we buy. Usually we can get tree measurement data through partnerships and things. We're going to have to start collecting our own data. At this point, we haven't yet begun doing that.
Tell me a little bit about what the modeling actually looks like. Let's talk about the sensors you're using. Is this straightforward spectral imagery, multispectral or hyperspectral? Is it coming off a satellite or are you flying drones?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that have been tried. The industry standard approach for this is to use LIDAR as the input. LIDAR is basically point cloud data that describes in 3D the shape of something. It's often used in self-driving cars. In this case, it's for forests. I highly recommend you look up pictures of forests taken with LIDAR cameras. They're very cool. But yeah, that can be either spaceborne or airborne. And we have played around with both. Again, spaceborne, you're going to get it in more places, but it's going to be less fine-grained from a satellite versus from a drone. You can get really high resolution, but in very specific places. So there are trade-offs. The standard is to use that as your input and then predict biomass from that. This means that you can usually get very high quality maps for places where you have good LIDAR data, because the LIDAR data is essentially giving you the inputs to those allometric equations. It's telling you the tree measurements. But the downside is you may not have it everywhere. So then people will tend to use optical satellite imagery as an input and then predict biomass from that. And then you can train corrective models between these. So you'll be able to get a biomass model in more places based on optical imagery as your input, but it won't be as good because the imagery can't capture all the things you want it to. And you're not just using the way the images look to the human eye. You're often using ratios between the bands that are known scientifically to capture information about plants or soil moisture and so on. We also use various other inputs that are not direct, like captures from the time we're observing. This might be weather observations over a long period of time so that we know basic climatic information about where we're trying to predict the biomass, because that can tell us the potential. A model trained just on those things can give you a pretty good estimate of biomass. It can't tell you anything specific about the current time. It'll just tell you if there was a super healthy forest here, how much biomass might it have? That kind of thing can help the model quite a bit.
Have data, have a hypothesis on some high-value insights that, if extracted automatically, could transform your business. Not sure how to proceed. Bounce your ideas off one of our data scientists with a free consult. Reach out at zionics.com. You'll talk to an expert, not a salesperson.
So help me wrap my head around this. So like if I'm looking at LIDAR data of a rainforest, I'm basically just able to tell that it's a rainforest. Is the model really learning the girth of particular trees and all that? Or are you ultimately relying on samples that you manually measured and then just saying this region is a particular type of rainforest in a particular type of area and then mapping it back to those measurements?
So it depends on how granular the LIDAR imagery is. In the process of rasterizing this point cloud, you often end up with it being resampled to a much lower resolution, so larger pixel size, which means you can't tell as much detail. But the raw point cloud can have tons of information. I've seen images where you can see like the shapes of every single layer in like a cedar tree or something. And it's very cool. If you have enough data, compute, and all the labels you would need, you could potentially have extremely high performance LIDAR models. The issue is always just having enough data. You need to have both the target, which is the biomass of a tree. If you can't geolocate your LIDAR imagery and your labels, like the biomass measurement, finely enough, then it's not useful. So that's part of why you would smooth it out a little, because even if you get the tree offset by a few meters, you still know the tree is in that big, the couple meter area, and then you can use it. The biomass is so highly concentrated in the very large trees that it works out.
I mean, is that ultimately what this comes down to, is counting the large trees?
It's not quite that simple, since that wouldn't allow you to capture things like regrowth. But I think that's definitely a big part of it. It can be really astonishing. A couple of times when I first started working on this kind of project, I would look at our labels and be like, but this couple square meter section, that's an impossible number. And then our forest science expert would be like, no, that's just where the old growth tree is. That number is so huge compared to all the things around it because there's one giant tree. The outliers can contain a lot of the biomass.
So at the end of the day, how accurate is it?
That is the $1 million question. The level of uncertainty captured in all of these steps is so high. The thing we look for in accuracy is matching up with the existing state of the art, which, as I mentioned earlier, the measurements through the allometric equations and the destructive testing, even that has a lot of error. So we want to match that as well as we can. And then we want to look at trends. We want to make sure that if our model that detects deforestation is detecting deforestation, that our biomass model is correctly saying that biomass has been lost. If we run this thing over a forest that we know is second growth versus old growth, we want to be sure that it's getting the correct trends. So you want to be sure that all of the trends are matching up, and then that the influence of those environmental potential variables are correctly being reflected. Like, we want to be sure that we're not just predicting based on potential. As long as all of those things are happening, the model is pretty trustworthy. But all of those things are very hard to match up with.
You must have been able to measure your stuff on a very particular scenario.
Yeah, we have accuracy bars that we require ourselves to meet before we can say that the model is good enough to use for evaluating a project. Basically, we have all these field plots, all these measurements, all this LIDAR data, all of this optical data, all of this radar data, which I didn't even mention, but sometimes we use that too. Ultimately, we need to build a model and run it somewhere else, because the places where we have these measurements are not the places we're concerned about, right? Because we're looking for the potential new reforestation places or new protected existing forests, not the places that have already been investigated heavily. So we want to be able to determine, is the model good enough to run in this specific place? You can't just say the model is this good, because running on a test split that comes out of your training data, which is pretty standard practice, that doesn't work very well for this kind of model, because everything is very spatially autocorrelated, which means if you just take a chunk of your training set and use it, you can get really amazing numbers, but they don't necessarily mean anything if the forest that you need to evaluate isn't spatially autocorrelated with your training data. There's a lot of figures and graphs that we need to inspect to look at the trends in all these different ways to assess whether we can trust any of the quantitative numbers that we're getting, because that qualitative assessment is still a huge part of determining whether the models are viable.
So from a customer standpoint, I mean, it might be depending on the customer, but like, you've got end consumers and you have corporations who might have exacting standards. Bottom line is, if some cattle farmer in Botswana agreed to reforest their land, you're going to know when they started sneaking their cows back on. Do you feel as of today, you're able to satisfy those stakeholders, or do you feel like you're at the very beginning of a very long road, or both?
I definitely think it's both. There are places in the world for which we have sufficient data and experience to do this well. And there are places that we don't yet. The fact that we know we can do it, but we haven't yet, is really exciting. And also not something I've felt at previous jobs in machine learning, where often we're solving much more known problems, and it's purely a matter of scale. We don't accept all projects from all registries. I don't know our rejection level, but it's pretty high. There's a lot of projects that we can take into consideration, and we determine the amount of verification that has already happened is not sufficient. So our standards apply this more frequent monitoring and more detailed monitoring are seeing problems with things. And we try to give that feedback to project developers so people can improve. And then our next step, what we're really working towards next year and starting now, is our own projects, which we will co-evaluate rather than being a secondary step.
Do you have a region where you're going to track carbon, and therefore you have to keep going with your data sampling until you reach a point where you're confident in the analysis? And at that point, that whole unit of land becomes sort of accessible to your customers and transparent and everything. And now it's being monitored properly. And now your team moves on to the next plot of land. Is that in essence the way you work?
Right now, we're not doing it in as orderly a fashion as that. We tend to go where the data is and where the projects are, rather than us being like, here's an area we want to roll out. I have heard talk that's something we want to start doing. And as we scale, hopefully we'll be able to. But for now, it's like we have this great data set that some university is willing to let us use, or some other researcher met somebody at a conference and is going to let us use their data. Then we can build a cool model for somewhere that we previously couldn't. Or we'll have a large company be like, hey, we want to support forest projects close to our headquarters. Do you have any? And so we find one and we have to verify it. We can find data. I don't know the level of specificity that goes into all of those decisions, but for now it's finding data and projects.
Pretty much describes almost every machine learning project out there. We all do that all the time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just different in your case because it actually translates into something interesting like forest.
I guess what makes it feel different to me is that it's physical place. Rather than chasing where the data is, I literally mean, where is the data?
I think it's actually funny because, as data scientists, we're so comfortable in this abstract intellectual land. It's not that often that you get projects grounded in physics and on Earth.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a weird question. Have you thought about tapping into private landowners, and maybe you've got apps or something, and you walk your property and you actually tap into them as users to generate stats for you, so that you don't have to send probably expensive teams to take measurements and stuff?
So if you want to ask, have you thought about doing this cool thing with forests? We definitely have. But some of the new iPhones have LIDAR.
Right.
To have citizen science teams go out and do that. And then, of course, our forest science expert will be like, citizen science can be dangerous. People can do things wrong. And there's so much satellite data that we don't yet use, and we could do things with it. And I can't even explain how many cool projects and problems there are still in this space to solve. For now, we're just doing forests, but grassland also captures carbon, and algae does. Maybe we could do that kind of thing. We have no plans for any of these yet, but the possibilities are endless here.
I totally appreciate your forest expert saying that sending out individuals has got its own set of problems, but isn't that kind of what always happens with machine learning? It's rarely the case where you can just go out and get easy ground truth. Those problems, if they're intersected with value, tend to have already been taken up.
Yeah.
And you can measure efficacy of your humans as well as you can measure the efficacy of your models. I didn't even think about volunteer teams. I was thinking of just randos walking around, but that makes more sense because you really do have so many people that want to do something about the state of the planet right now. if you organize teams, they go out, they take measurements, then you could measure them against your actual ground truth.
I think that if we could develop an uncertainty model of the humans collecting the data,
Yeah, exactly.
that's a theoretical thing that could be done. There's truly like unlimited number of cool projects that could be done with the fact that we can collect more data.
So what does the demand for your credits look like?
Right now, I think we're more bound by supply than demand, actually. We're in this new space of high frequency and high fidelity monitoring. A lot of projects don't yet pass our bar. We're not the only ones looking at this. There's been a lot of headlines of some nonprofits doing similar stuff to us, critiquing existing carbon registries, and different carbon registries will critique each other. There are more big companies mostly who want to be spending money on real carbon offsets, and it's hard to find enough. We need to tap into this market before they get frustrated and go away. And also we need to, for the planet's sake, most people at Pachama are just like the people who want to protect forests for any reason, even if the money wasn't involved. But that's not the world we live in. We need to find ways to direct money to these projects so that they will happen.
The nonprofit sector does amazing work. The scale of this problem is daunting. It's daunting, and the time scale within which we have to solve it is comparably daunting, and if not more so. One question I had for you is on these corporate buyers, are they the ones pushing you for higher and higher efficacy in your modeling practice and quantification of the carbon that's actually being offset for a particular area?
I won't say no, because I think they definitely have teams pushing on that. I know some in specific who have like very specific ideas of how they want us to do this, but more what I feel on the machine learning side is the university or government entities putting out papers in the field who we need to look at what they're doing, compare ourselves to them, and see if our stuff matches. Sometimes those will be on more tractable problems because they will, they're not trying to do anywhere. They usually have a specific data set they're trying to model, but we need to be able to match their performance at least. And we need to be able to explain why we can't, if we can't, that kind of thing. So that's where I personally really feel it in my work, but I think it's coming from all sides. A lot of governments are working on very similar problems because they need to, and this is a problem that everyone's trying to solve. And also, there are both voluntary and government-run credit markets, and I don't know what kinds of standards are being enforced within the government ones. We play fully in the voluntary market. I don't know exactly how that differs, but I'm sure it does. A lot of the papers that we're reading and the people we're talking to are often people who are in government positions.
So for the sake of our listeners and me, frankly, because I don't know the stories at all, how do the carbon markets work? What's the equivalent of the NASDAQ and the Dow? And what are you buying? Are there ETF equivalents? How does that whole thing work?
It's simultaneously like a Wild West and also extremely monitored. Everyone playing in the field is super invested in it being real and wanting it to work. But there isn't like a single entity like the equivalent of
the SEC or something.
Yeah, that's monitoring it all. There's lots of big players, like the one that I have followed the longest, I guess, is Vera. They do a lot of, they don't do things that are technically similar to us, but we piggyback off of a lot of their more manual work, and they've been working in this area for a really long time. Not all carbon credits are nature-based, like we're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
That are green energy projects, all kinds of things. And so that's a whole other can of worms of how do you verify how much carbon emissions are being avoided through that kind of project. And there are other organizations and companies trying to make that more legit. But the whole thing is just a need that is not being filled. And there's a lot of different players trying to fix it. But to what your point about, like, is there equivalent like ETFs? There can be bundles where, and this is something that we sell, rather than buying a very specific thing, it's more like, here's a chunk of money, get me some carbon credits with it. And then for whatever projects we happen to have, some companies will be really specific about who they want to support, whether that's location or type of forest. Some people are very particular about whether they want reforestation or avoided deforestation. And I guess it's like an aesthetic choice. But the more balanced portfolio would be to be doing some of each in different parts of the world, because they all have different kinds of risks and different kinds of uncertainties. And if you diversify, you're probably doing better.
I get the idea of companies offsetting and buying these credits, but are they selling them too? And, are there investors trying to buy a certain type of credit? If the demand is low and the price starts spiking, at the end of the day, that's going to translate into more dollars available to some rancher somewhere to...
As long as it doesn't just involve a bunch of money going into the wrong person's pocket rather than the creator. It's definitely possible that would be good. I think the real fear is that prices inflate and then the things that are being speculated on end up being not very high quality credits. And then there are big, scary headlines around that. Because in an industry as unregulated as this one, there are a lot of things that are not being properly vetted, or people are attempting but don't know what they're doing. So
that comes down to what you guys are doing, right? You've got these credits, but not all credits are created equally. Yeah. And you want transparency around the credit. You're basically saying this credit connects with this forest, which has this audit trail behind it and this commitment to a future trail behind it. You're basically validating the worth of that credit.
That's exactly what we are doing. And we just hope that we can scale that up to meet the level of need. And that's why supply and demand is really weird to talk about, because obviously the supply and demand matter for us as a company, but they don't matter for the world. The world needs this, whether there's supply or demand. We need to just fix it.
Yeah, it's just a mechanism, right? At the end of the day, we need the carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
We just need to suck it out.
As the big biodiversity, I don't know if it was a treaty or accord that was signed, carbon is only one of our big problems that this kind of solution can solve. Like switching to using a carbon credit that involves switching to green energy doesn't address the biodiversity crisis, whereas nature-based carbon credits do.
Yeah. You could imagine a world where you're wildly successful. These credits are worth a lot and they increase in value. People, instead of cutting down a region or leaving it alone and allowing it to maintain its biodiversity, start planting the densest trees imaginable in the most dense fashion imaginable, in which case no living species care about it. That would still be effective, but it's not pricing of it.
Yeah, there are definitely ways things can be done poorly. That's why it's important that we have that final step of it passes all of our carbon checks, but does it also have other good side effects? You don't want just a giant tree plantation to be the only thing that you ever are growing. Because, a tree plantation is better than a strip mall, but it's not as good as it could be if that land could be developed in a better way.
Yeah, I think ecosystems aren't optimized for carbon extraction, right? But it's maybe a factor that happens to be.
I do think there are many places, and I'm not an expert on this part, but it seems from what I've seen that in a lot of cases, if you let the forest manage itself or let indigenous communities manage the forest, it does better on both its health and also carbon sequestration than what we would guess would be the best. If you grow it super dense, it often will have higher rates of disease, be at greater risk of forest fire. Short-term optimizing for just carbon isn't actually going to optimize for a 50-year scale carbon.
So tell me, what are the big AI problems? Taking it back to the machine learning side, what are the big AI problems in this space that you think represent the next 5 to 10 years of effort?
I think we are going to get more different kinds of satellites. There are so many satellites being launched all the time. Finding how to integrate that information and use it productively for this project. In my dream world, we would have enough satellite information and labeled data to be able to model biomass at a total scale. I don't think that's impossible. I think it's definitely possible. I don't know how likely it is because I don't think it's a priority. When you launch a satellite, they're often telecommunications. They don't have this kind of camera on board. Even the ones that do are not always fully available. But I think that's a thing that could happen. I also think expanding the same general technology that is currently being used, the current approaches and just finding ways to correctly and forever improving how we monitor the risk. Because like I mentioned, there's an uncertainty. There's all the things that can hurt a forest and all of the messiness in our labeled data. So if we can come up with clever ways of understanding all of the places where that breaks down, like we mentioned before, and some theoretical model to tell how bad the people were at getting the data, we could get more data if we knew that. I'm sure there are ways we can plug in more things.
Here's a question that popped in my head. I was driving through rural Botswana, through all these kind of cattle country. And in Botswana, there's a point where you cross a fence. And you literally pull over, they inspect your car for any weird food issues. As soon as you cross that fence, you're in a totally different world. There's bajillions of elephants and all kinds of wildlife. On one side is pretty much cattle and whoever escaped the fence. And on the other side is this other arena. And while I was driving through there, it struck my mind that the world doesn't need another acre of burgers being produced. But this land on the other side of the fence is some of the most precious stuff I've ever seen in my life. And I've traveled a fair amount and seen a lot of stuff, but it just feels like it's so vulnerable, but it's also so mind-blowing. Thousands of elephants just wandering around and leopards and everything. And I just can't help but wonder, for that one farmer who's going to burn down that 1 acre of land, what is the dollar cost of that acre of land to that farmer? Because a lot of these folks are not super wealthy people. It just doesn't seem like it's that expensive for us to take your carbon credit valuation, figure out what that stuff's worth, maybe price in some biodiversity, value, and have it so the rest of us are buying these things on the wealthy side of the world. That farmer is literally just getting paid to not cut down their forest.
So I think democratization of carbon credits is a big part of it. Like right now, a lot of the projects running on the major registries are pretty big, because that's what makes sense economically when you have to go inspect them. But if we can get to a point where we can do this using a fully remote sensing model, we could be assessing the value of the land right next to one farmer's property and offering him whatever amount and giving him the skills and the incentive to protect it. And I think it's made easier by the fact that a lot of these people already do love that land just as much as tourists up there, and they don't want to have to cut it down. But when given a choice between eating and not, it's not a fair position that we put people in.
So how far away do you think that time is where your team can go into a map of the world, draw boundaries around areas that you're dying to protect, price that land, and route cash to those folks and just literally buy the forestry rights or whatever?
I suspect it will vary a lot by location in the world, both based on having government support for that sort of thing and community support. If it's in a place where we have been able to establish trust, that kind of thing will go in more quickly. And this was something that was talked about by some of the protesters at COP26 last week, was about this whole issue of, it's like colonialism, the rich countries coming in and telling indigenous communities, don't cut your forest down, we're going to give you money. And no one is actually doing that yet, really, because it's not technically feasible, but it is a thing that's being proposed and it's a thing that needs to happen. But it seems like to them on the ground, a bunch of Western people who know nothing about their land showing up and telling them, don't cut this forest down. I mean, why should they trust that we actually know anything?
They download an app, walk the perimeter of their property, take their iPhone, shoot some LIDAR imagery, then they put in their bank account and they press a button that says, here, you get a monthly payment.
I think that it's a thing that can happen and that we will be able to reach a point where people are comfortable with that. But to a lot of the people who currently are the ones closest to this land, they're the least involved in this whole world of global finance. They're like, why should I give you my bank account information? You're going to take all my money.
It's like that for a little while, but as soon as their buddy gets $100 a month, they're going to go do it. I mean,
getting to that point is going to be harder than we want it to be. And I also think there is room for exploitation here that we need to make sure that we steer clear of. Because anytime you're talking about wealthy people trying to influence the behavior of less wealthy people, you're in a dangerous place.
Sure.
Even though in this case, we're all well-intentioned, there are going to be bad actors, and we just need to make sure that we catch them quickly before they hurt anyone. I think it's fraught. I think it's very important. And I think that we have room to make the world and people's lives a lot better. We just have to make sure we actually do.
So I think this has been a totally enlightening conversation for me. I feel like I understand this whole carbon credit arena better than I did before. So I want to thank you a ton for that. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm understanding the role of machine learning and AI with respect to the monitoring problem better. I want to end with the question that I suppose is on everybody's minds who's following COP26. What's going to happen? Are we really going to get our shit together and save the world or not?
Man, I wish I knew. When I took this job, I was like, I'm either going to feel way better because I'm going to be spending all of my time trying to solve this problem, or I'm going to feel way worse because I'm going to never be able to avoid hearing news about it. And I think it's really been both. The news is often bad, but not always. There is progress. There are major companies who at this point are doing this because they want to, because they feel the consumer pressure to invest in offsetting their emissions, including a lot of companies who are offsetting their historical emissions, which is
wow.
Huge. And a lot of,
even wanting to do that is good.
Yeah, there's a lot of critiques that I've heard that are like, well, isn't this just a license to emit more? Not if they're going back 50 or 100 years and offsetting all of their emissions.
Can you imagine if Shell and Chevron and Exxon did that? I mean, that's amazing.
Amazing. So it's very cool. There is progress happening. It remains to be seen whether it's fast enough. I think we're at the point now where we have to be honest with ourselves. Anything we do is better than doing nothing, but I don't think we're going to be able to do enough. We're already seeing the effects of climate change. We're not going to be able to undo the heat wave that happened last summer and killed people. It already happened. It's already here, but we can do more than we're currently doing. And hopefully we will.
Oh my God. I know. And it's so immediate and so real. I mean, like literally 3 days ago, we had these massive floods in Bellingham and Vancouver and Abbotsford. And my personal Facebook feed is just filled with my best friend in the world's got, a pump. And he's just going into friends' houses and pumping out basins.
Yeah.
An insane.
I saw all these people marking themselves as safe from the flooding.
Yeah. We both sadly know that in another 2 months, there's going to be another something somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't want to go down the dark side because I really want to focus on how much awesome work you guys are doing. Yeah. What can regular people do? What can our audience do tomorrow or today? They're listening to this today. Can they go somewhere and offset some credits and immediately do something? What do you think is the one thing they could do?
Constant debate I'm having with myself too, right? If individuals can offset their carbon emissions, I think a big thing is if you're at a corporation, push for them to do it too. I know that our website does support individuals purchasing, but our main focus is on
companies.
Corporations. Just because it's so much bigger, individual transactions are pretty small, but they're super important. I see them coming in all the time. Offset your carbon. Be aware that it's a societal level shift that needs to happen, and to be the person in your social circle encouraging everybody else to make whatever changes they can. Be super aware whenever you're doing something, whenever you're given the choice to emit more or less. Like Google now will tell you which route on Google Map is going to emit more CO2, or which flight you purchase is likely to be more efficient. Pay attention to those things. Look at them the same way you would like spending money, because you are spending the carbon budget and we are already over budget.
That's all for your AI injection. As always, thanks for tuning in. If you've enjoyed this episode, we've got a 2-part article series on carbon sequestration with AI up on our website at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com/articles. Please feel free to tell your friends about us, give us a review, and check out our past episodes at podcast.xionyx.com or on your regular podcast platform.